Hello and welcome back to Sam Not So Wise. My name is Sam and today we're doing episode 2 of underrated and underhyped books. Books that people maybe don't talk too much about, at least in the circles of YouTube that I follow anyway. So I'm going to be talking about a sci-fi classic author in John Wyndham, talking about the 3 books I've read, and also one book by George Orwell. So like I said, I don't really see people talking about John Wyndham so much on YouTube, even though I feel like he really deserves to be in the conversation. Orwell is obviously talked about quite a lot, but mainly 1984 and Animal Farm. And this is a book that I don't think I've seen anybody talk about. So yes, whilst these authors might be pretty popular and well known, I don't really see people talking about these in particular. So with much further ado, and maybe some children screaming outside, let's talk about some underrated, underhyped books. So first we're going to talk about John Wyndham. He is a classic sci-fi writer, writing in the 50s and 60s, so kind of like just before and during the golden age of sci-fi, but he kind of goes under the radar a little bit. And he wrote books that were kind of concepts and ideas in sci-fi which are now very well used. So he was, amongst the forebears of the people writing these kind of ideas, and he has a lot of standout examples which we'll talk about soon. And he was a big influence on later writers. People have expressed that he has been a huge influence on their writing. People like Brian Aldiss, David Mitchell, Margaret Atwood, amongst others. And he always wrote kind of like quite charming sci-fi. It's been called like cozy catastrophe. So a lot of the settings are kind of like small villages and everything's happening in this little context and in this like 50s and 60s style. So you really get this like cozy Britishness, but also lots of awful things are going on at the same time. Not always, as we'll see, but that is a big part of the appeal to me. This is such charming writing, but also big ideas. And he has genuine thought experiments, and big themes, but it's always fun and always got that little bit of British charm. So let's talk about some John Wyndham books. So I've only actually read 3 of John Wyndham's books, and he wrote 7 in those 2 decades that he was writing. And I've only really read 3 because I like finding these shabby old secondhand copies, the kind of slightly ugly covers. I absolutely love them. So I just pick them up when I find them in a decent enough condition to read and they're not going to fall apart, which is hard in Iceland, obviously. But yes, I've read 3 of the 7, and we'll start by talking about The Day of the Triffids, which is probably his most well-known book, and it has been adapted. A lot of his works have been adapted, actually, because they just make great stories. But this is an apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic book. So we start kind of just before the apocalypse happens, and we see the fallout of humanity and then the survival. And what happens is, it's not a spoiler because it happens right at the start, but like 99% of the world's population go blind after a cosmic event. And there's also these very bizarre plants that have been growing on Earth before, but now they're kind of not being looked after, and they are on the loose, and they have a mind of their own and a deadly whip. And they basically start hunting humans. So you have this twofold problem of almost everybody being blind and these killer plants out to kill everybody. So obviously the inevitable apocalyptic fight for survival happens, which I love following. And it's funny to see it from this like 1950s perspective where technology was obviously a lot less. So it's a nice little time capsule in that way. But it also becomes a story of how humans don't really learn from previous mistakes, and power and tribalism sets in, and it all becomes a power play, and not necessarily people caring about other people's survival. But obviously our protagonists aren't like that because, this is very classic. And it just turns out to be a book that's about finding your people and fighting together against the evils that just keep coming up over and over again, no matter how bad the world happens. to be, you know. So it's very charming. It's classic apocalyptic. If you love apocalyptic books, you need to put this in your locker and read it. The next one I'll talk about is the Midwich Cuckoos, and yes, this also has an adaptation. Has a different name, I believe. I can't remember what it is. I haven't watched it because I don't watch many films. So, but this is a really interesting book. It's about a sleepy town. Again, like I was saying, Day of the Triffids is more spread out, but this is about a sleepy town which suddenly becomes surrounded by an invisible barrier where if anybody goes into it, then they fall unconscious. They're not dead, but they fall unconscious. You pull them out, they're back awake again. So it's kind of one of the first books where there's kind of an enclosed town, if you think of like Under the Dome by Stephen King, that kind of concept. And a very strange thing happens because, again, it's not really a spoiler because it happens quite early, but all of the women within this little town become pregnant, having not done the business, as it were. And once the children are born, it soon becomes apparent that not everything is right. There's something off about these children. But I cannot go further from there because that will completely spoil it. But this story becomes basically about finding a way of dealing with being an isolated town and the problems of threats, both, you know, from the people within the town and also this new threat that has come, this external threat, but is within the town, if you know what I mean. But it's a book about isolation because these people are isolated for a fairly long time and a lot of weird stuff is going on. And it's also about the stresses of small town communities when everybody knows each other and knows everybody's vices and stuff. And it's a struggle of difficult decisions for the greater good. They have to make some decisions about what to do about it, which, you know, it's not very clear what the right answer is morally. So there's a lot of moral questions in this book. But it's also about family and relationships and close communities. And it is an absolute thrill ride and, again, super charming. So the final John Wyndham book I'll talk about is Chocky. And this is not about chocolate, but that would be okay with me because I love me some Chocky. Anyway, this is about a boy of age 12 who has an imaginary friend. And, you know, people are like, you're too old to have an imaginary friend. What's going on here? But again, it's quite early on, so I'll tell you who this imaginary friend is. It turns out this imaginary friend presents as an alien ambassador from another world who are trying to find somewhere else that they can live because their planet is going tits up, as we say, in good old Blighty. And there's a lot of trying to work out the validity of this and how it's affecting this child, and, you know, this alien influences his life when they shouldn't be because that's against their protocols as an alien race. But, you know, they're quite benevolent aliens. And it's not a very plot-focused story, so there's not much I can say about the plot. It's a lot about the internal struggles of this child and questions of identity and about unknowns and the power of knowledge, that kind of stuff. And because of the unknown, you know, people are questioning whether they trust this child. And it's a lot about sanity and, you know, children growing up. So it's a very intimate story about a small family that has wider concepts in the world and, I guess, the galaxy. And it's a really quick read and a fascinating study of children's psyche. So those are the three I've read. I would happily read every single one that he's written. That is the plan. I just need to find them. The one that I really want to read is The Chrysalids, which is probably his second most famous book. So I am on the hunt for that book because it's supposed to be amazing. But in conclusion, John Wyndham wrote absolutely charming but thoroughly thought-provoking sci-fi books. And they're quintessentially British, But they have, like I said, they have huge sci-fi ideas, and very early on in, the sci-fi history. So they're extremely influential books and very important if you're a sci-fi completionist. But also, look how tiny they are. They are very quick reads, but they pack a punch. So they're great palate cleansers. And yeah, I just highly recommend you read John Wyndham, maybe starting with The Day of the Triffids. So the last book I'll talk about in this video is by George Orwell, who happens to be one of my favourite authors of all time. I've read every single thing he's written. But my favourite book by him is 1984, but it's not that, because that's obviously not underhyped or underrated. This is going to be Burmese Days, which was the first book he ever wrote. And yes, this is a contemporary fiction. I guess it's not contemporary anymore. It's a modern classic. So this is not sci-fi or fantasy, which is a rare thing on my channel, but I do read those occasionally. And this was based upon Orwell's time serving as a police officer in Burma in the 1920s. Burma now being Myanmar, of course, but it was called Burma at the time, hence Burmese Days. So yeah, it's based upon his real experiences of being in this country at this time when the British were still an empire and, in charge of a lot of areas of southern India. Editing Sam here to tell you I meant southern Asia. So this chronicles the typical life of a bunch of Brits in this declining empire. So, they're still there, but things are going downhill. Their influence isn't as strong as it was, but it's kind of become ingrained in their culture because it's been quite a long time. And it follows all of the political machinations of the people there, both the occupiers, the Brits, and the locals. But because the Brits have been there so long and their influence is kind of waning as the empire wanes, it's kind of showing the mundanity, I think that's the word, how mundane it is for the people that work there on behalf of the empire. And it's questioning, what good is actually being done anymore? Is any good being done? And it shows what a kind of difficult job they had and how lonely it could be. Now, this is not me kind of like saying, oh, boohoo, poor British people, because there are huge questions about the validity of them being there, the morality of them being there, all of those big questions that need to be explored, and not many people do in such an honest way. And George Orwell was extremely honest about how things looked there, and it's a very deep look into how awful it could be for both the occupiers and the occupied. Obviously, the occupied had it worse. Now, don't let the mundanity fool you into thinking this is a boring book where people are just sitting around drinking gin, which does happen, but the people's lives are changed severely when there are new arrivals, British arrivals, to the place that they are stationed. And it becomes somewhat of a romance between our main character and one of these new arrivals. But it's not a typical romance. It's not like super predictable. Things are moving backwards and forwards, and it's highly affected by the huge political strains that are put on these people, both from within and without. And also just the customs of the time, the customs of kind of the empire and how they do things out there as well. There are very specific customs, so it's very complicated. And, as typical for George Orwell, things do not go amazingly well. I won't give you any spoilers, but, it's not a very happy book. There are happy moments, but there's a lot of depressing stuff. And I'm talking about everything here: romance, politics, friendships, all of that kind of stuff. But yes, it's not hugely plot focused, but the plot is interesting, but it's more about the political questions and moral questions of what is going on in South Asia at this time. If you're not from this part of the world, then the imagery will really suck you in as well. It's very deep imagery, both the beauty of this country and this climate where, British people aren't used to it, and seeing it through the eyes of somebody who grew up in the UK and who is now getting used to this world. It's really beautiful at times, and you know, exotic to somebody who's lived in rainy old Britain, but also the horrors of this place, because you know, whilst we can talk about them, you know, being occupied and not having their freedom, they also have their big moral problems as well. And you see a lot of the horrors of what was going on in these countries, even, you know, without British influence, but also with, of course, because we meddled with everything. But yes, there's colonialism is obviously the key issue of this story, and it's just such a nuanced approach. You know, the morals of British and the occupiers, the occupied and the occupiers. And of course, it leads to questions of racism and how people saw these locals and how they treated them, and how it was pretty horrible most of the time. So yes, not a very happy book, but it is a deep book, and it is fascinating, and it is my second favourite George Orwell book. And I really think that this book should be talked about more, because it's important. It's important, and it's good, and it gets you thinking, and it tugs at your heartstrings many, many times. So please give this a chance if you haven't. More people need to talk about this book. Okay, that's it for this episode of Underrated and Underhyped. If you've made it this far into the video, I thank you so much. I appreciate every view, every comment, every like, every hate comment. Haven't actually got any. Let me know if you hate these books, hate these authors, love these books, love these authors. Please like and subscribe and join the journey. And I will see you in another video soon. Goodbye.